Ladies and gentlemen in relationships, whether romantic, familial, or social, boundaries are not optional add-ons. They are fundamental to psychological well-being and personal identity. They are not merely lines drawn in the sand to dictate what others can or cannot do around you. Rather, boundaries define who you are and who you are not. They establish the perimeter of your emotional territory. Without them, the self becomes porous, undefined, and easily manipulated by the demands and behaviors of others. When a person fails to establish or enforce boundaries, it's often out of fear of conflict, of abandonment, of being misunderstood. And so many people allow small transgressions to slide, a dismissive comment, a broken promise, a moment of disregard. These may seem insignificant in isolation, but over time they accumulate into a pattern where one person adapts, shrinks, and censors themselves in order to maintain peace, while the other continues behaving as if the balance of the relationship naturally tilts in their favor. This dynamic doesn't emerge overnight. It is constructed slowly, habitually, and often invisibly. The more one person compromises their sense of self, the more the other comes to expect it. What was once a generous act becomes an obligation. What was once patience becomes an expectation of tolerance. And what was once an occasional concession becomes the permanent climate of the relationship. Now, when someone finally decides to walk away from such a dynamic, it can be jarring for the other party, not because they didn't see it coming, but because they never truly believed it would come. The mistake was never in the leaving, it was in staying silent too long, in not enforcing the boundary when it was first crossed, in believing that love or loyalty required endurance instead of mutual respect. Boundaries, when properly communicated and maintained, act as stabilizers. They tell others, "This is how I wish to be treated, this is where I draw the line," but many people delay this confrontation. They fear it will hurt the relationship. Ironically, by refusing to set boundaries early on, they pave the way for deeper ruptures later. When someone leaves a relationship after their boundaries have been continuously ignored or violated, they are not acting impulsively. They are restoring order. They are saying, "I will no longer allow myself to be shaped by conditions that reduce me." From a psychological standpoint, asserting boundaries is an act of self-definition. It reflects a clear understanding of one's values, limits, and needs. People who cannot define their boundaries struggle to maintain their identity in the presence of strong personalities. They bend, they yield, and they justify behaviors that, deep down, they know are unacceptable. They begin to internalize the idea that speaking up is selfish, that resistance is unkind, but the reality is the opposite. Setting a boundary is one of the most honest and respectful things you can do, not just for yourself, but for the other person. It gives them clarity, it removes ambiguity, it invites maturity. Those who push against your boundaries the hardest are often the ones most invested in keeping you in a diminished role. They benefit from your silence. Your absence of resistance is their license to continue as they please. That is why the moment you finally walk away, when you truly remove yourself, they experience shock. Not because they didn't understand your frustration, but because they never believed you'd act on it. Your leaving reasserts your agency in the most undeniable way possible. In this way, boundaries don't just protect. They transform. They compel others to reevaluate their behavior. They expose dynamics that were unsustainable. They force a confrontation with reality. And above all, they reclaim the self from relationships that no longer honor it. So, if you find yourself constantly exhausted in a relationship, if you're always managing someone else's reactions while neglecting your own, consider this. Boundaries aren't walls to keep people out. They are frameworks that allow healthy connection to happen. Without them, there is no real intimacy, only dependency, control, and fear. And once you understand this deeply, you'll see that leaving is not abandonment. It's a final expression of a boundary long ignored. It's not about punishing the other person. It's about affirming your own worth. Leaving a relationship, especially one where you've invested time, emotion, and effort, is often seen as a failure or a sign of weakness. Culturally and emotionally, we are taught to stay, to fix, to endure. But there comes a point where staying becomes a deeper moral compromise than walking away. At that point, leaving is not merely a practical or emotional decision. It is an ethical one. It becomes a stand for personal integrity, dignity, and psychological well-being. When someone repeatedly finds themselves in a situation where they are disrespected, ignored, or diminished, the cost is not just emotional discomfort, it is erosion of self. Each time a person tolerates behavior that goes against their values or wounds their sense of worth, they are not just sacrificing peace, they are negotiating pieces of their identity. Over time, this turns into a kind of moral fatigue. You begin to question not just the other person's behavior, but your own willingness to allow it, to stay in a space that denies your full humanity, that demands silence in the face of disregard, is to become complicit in your own mistreatment. This is where the moral dimension of leaving begins to reveal itself. The decision to walk away is no longer just about personal relief. It becomes an act of reclaiming ethical alignment. It's saying, I refuse to contribute to a system where harm is normalized and accountability is absent. It's important to understand that leaving does not mean abandoning your responsibility to love or care for others, but it does mean recognizing the limits of what you can repair alone. Relationships, by nature, are mutual. Respect, growth, and consideration cannot be one-sided projects. If you are the only one bending, explaining, forgiving, and adapting, the imbalance becomes unsustainable, not just emotionally, but morally. You begin to live in contradiction, saying one thing and tolerating another, standing for values you no longer enforce. There is a subtle form of dishonesty in staying too long in such a space. Dishonest not because your feelings are insincere, but because your actions no longer reflect your beliefs. You may say you value self-respect, yet stay in a dynamic that strips it away. You may claim to prioritize emotional safety, yet continually put yourself in the line of emotional harm. This misalignment creates inner tension, what psychologists refer to as cognitive dissonance, and the longer this tension persists, the more you experience anxiety, resentment, confusion, and even shame. Leaving, therefore, is not a rejection of the other person so much as it is an affirmation of truth. It is the moment when what you believe and what you do come into alignment. It is the choice to stop enabling, to stop pretending, and to begin living congruently with your principles. There's another layer to this moral framework: the impact your staying has on the other person. Contrary to what many believe, constantly absorbing someone else's poor behavior doesn't teach them love. It teaches them impunity. It tells them that there are no consequences, that they can continue acting out, and the relationship will remain intact. But when you leave, when you make that final decision after long patience and effort, it sends a message that can't be ignored. It introduces accountability. In many cases, that accountability becomes a catalyst for growth. The other person, often for the first time, is forced to confront the consequences of their actions. The silence and presence they once took for granted is no longer available. Your absence becomes a mirror. Sometimes, it's only in that vacuum that they recognize the cost of their behavior. Whether or not they grow from it is their responsibility. But your decision to leave may be the first truly ethical act within the dynamic, the one that stops enabling and starts confronting. And for you, it is the beginning of psychological repair, not because you've escaped, but because you've realigned. You've chosen self-respect over appeasement. You've prioritized truth over comfort. That is not abandonment. That is maturity. It is a return to ethical clarity, a choice to no longer participate in a dynamic that demands your silence and rewards your suffering. In this way, leaving isn't running away, it's waking up. It's choosing to live in a way that matches your values and respects your worth. It's a decision that requires courage, but more than that, it demands honesty with yourself and with the reality you've tried for so long to overlook. When someone is shocked that you finally left a relationship, that shock is rarely about your actual departure. It is almost never rooted in the logistical reality of your absence, your physical relocation, your silence, your no longer being available. Rather, the shock stems from a deeper psychological place, the collapse of an assumption, the assumption that you would never do it, that you didn't have it in you, that your loyalty, your emotional investment, your attachment would outweigh your sense of limits, dignity, and self-worth. This assumption isn't always conscious. People don't often sit down and deliberately think, "They'll never leave me," but they act in ways that imply it. They test boundaries repeatedly. They disregard emotional cues. They neglect your needs or manipulate your vulnerability. And each time you stay, each time you accommodate, you reinforce their internal narrative that this is the natural order of the relationship, that you are the constant, the dependable one, the one who absorbs, forgives, and stays. This kind of dynamic is built on a psychological illusion of permanence. In this illusion, your presence is taken for granted, as though it's a fixed part of the emotional environment rather than a decision you continually make. That illusion is dangerous because it removes the sense of responsibility from the other party. If they believe you won't leave, then the urgency to reflect, to adjust, to respect your emotional needs diminishes. Your flexibility becomes their comfort zone. Your patience becomes their blind spot. Now, when that illusion breaks, when you finally act on what you've been silently feeling, it disrupts their entire framework. Your leaving becomes not just a change in behavior, but a profound confrontation with their own misconceptions. It tells them you were not staying because you couldn't leave. You were staying because you chose to. And now, you've chosen differently. What's crucial to understand here is that this moment of leaving isn't just the end of a relationship dynamic. It's a psychological revelation. It forces the other person to confront the fact that you had agency all along, that your silence wasn't powerlessness, that your tolerance wasn't weakness, that your presence was never owed. This reversal is what causes the shock. It's the collapse of their assumed control over your responses. For the person who leaves, this moment can feel paradoxical. On the one hand, there is clarity and strength. On the other, there is the weight of being misunderstood, of being accused of betrayal, or of being seen as the one who gave up. But in reality, you didn't just leave, you responded. You responded to repeated signals that your presence was not truly valued, that your boundaries were negotiable, that your emotional labor was expected but not reciprocated. From an educational perspective, this is a vital moment of growth for both individuals, if they choose to learn from it. For the one who left, it is a return to self-respect and responsibility. It demonstrates that self-sacrifice has a limit and that personal worth is not contingent on endurance. For the one left behind, it presents an opportunity to reevaluate their assumptions, to understand the consequences of their complacency or entitlement. Importantly, this pattern is not unique to romantic relationships. It appears in families, friendships, workplaces, anywhere human beings build expectations about others based on past behavior, and in each case, the wake-up call is the same. People stay until they don't. They give until giving becomes too costly. They endure until endurance begins to destroy the self. The shock, then, is not because you disappeared. It's because you finally made a decision that others didn't believe you were capable of. You proved them wrong, not with aggression or revenge, but with quiet finality. You broke the illusion and in doing so revealed a truth Presence is a privilege, not a promise. When that truth is ignored long enough, absence becomes the only honest response. In this way, your leaving becomes a statement of reality. It teaches that human connection must be based on mutual recognition, not assumption. That permanence in relationships should never be presumed, it must be earned, sustained, and respected. And once it's lost, it's not the leaving that needs to be questioned, but the conditions that made it necessary.